Earlier this year, a very popular Netflix special called Tiger King was released, which kind of took the world by storm. It was entertaining, it was dramatic, it was comedic, a little bit sad, but it definitely highlighted an interesting topic in the United States, which is exotic animals and the role they play in our economy and kind of their rights and more or lack of. Well, today on the Tonic Accord, we're going to be talking a little bit about that in a more global context, the world exotic animal trade and how it kind of links to major markets in Asia. We'll cover this and more today on the Tonic Accord. Hey, Alex. Thanks for joining me again. For everyone that don't know, I'm Drew, and I'm joined by my co-host and good friend Alex Kapitko, who's now back in the States, thankfully. And how's it been so far?
Yeah, it's okay, man. I haven't really left the house. Kind of self isolation for the most part. The CDC, recommends because since I came from a hotspot, but I've been running and working from home and catching up on books and Netflix. So other than that, yeah, I'm okay. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. But yeah, how about you?
6 out of 10. Yeah, I'm hanging in there as well. I'm still hunkered down, still working from home. It does seem like cases are spiking again
Yeah.
here in Southern California as well. So it's weird. It's a weird time. But it almost I remember at the beginning of this whole like quarantine thing. This show came out, Tiger King, and it was pretty much like the pop cultural hotspot for a while. I mean, everyone was saying you gotta watch Tiger King, you gotta watch Tiger King, and eventually I did watch it. And obviously, the show is mostly about the character himself, the guy Joe Exotic or whatever. But
Yeah.
it did get me thinking about this exotic animal trade. Like for one, is there's more Bengal tigers in Texas than there are in the Bay of Bengal. And you're like, wait, what? And it got me, a little bit curious about this, this trade or this, black market for exotic animals or gray area, right? In the United States, at least, it's kind of dependent on the separate states. That's why places like Florida and Texas have all these exotic animals, but in California, not so much. So it definitely got me interested in the topic, and I started to look into, what National Geographic has been reporting about the, wildlife trade around the world, and I was shocked to find some numbers and some disturbing images.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know where to start on this one because, yeah, like you said, I mean, like just a side note, Tiger King. Yeah, I think it is interesting, and my theory is why it took off so much during the quarantine and the beginning of this is because I think it kind of explains the world zeitgeist right now. Everyone's just looking for some ridiculous distraction,
Right.
but it's true that through that there really is an interesting discussion to be had about animals, exotic animals, and kind of just the treatment of animals around the world. And I think it is a really relevant topic, especially with this global pandemic with the novel coronavirus as well, just because though the exact origins of SARS-CoV-2 are unknown still, it is very clear that it probably did originate from a bat and then transferred to an intermediary animal, probably a mammal like a pangolin or something.
Right.
And these are all animals that are rare, exotic, and endangered, and are usually in trade in Asian markets, usually in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. And it's just interesting to me because I think in the United States, we have a very different view of what these animals are. I think to us, they're that beautiful picture in National Geographic. They're that animal that you go to, safari in Kenya to see. But there's like several degrees of isolation and separation from us and these cats, for example, as a tiger or something. And so there's a fascination with us. But I think worryingly enough, it's this separation that makes us almost think of them as more of a commodity than an actual living endangered species. And clearly in parts of Asia and other parts of Africa, as well as where they eat bushmeat and these other things, it's clear that there is a tradition that exists. It's been there for a long time. And I think it's just with media and the knowledge that we now have, it's shining a light on it. And many of us are disturbed, and rightfully so. But I'm just confused on how you would stop a tradition that's as old as China itself, for example.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, right? So when you watch Tiger King, the the objective is really right. You have these animals so that people can take photos and you know and look cool with a tiger, and then the business makes money. There's a lot of talk about conservation and stuff, but frankly, I don't really see Joe Exotic and I forget the other guy. The other guy,
Carol. Well, there's Carol Baskin.
Carol
too.
Baskin, yeah, with Pete and stuff. But I saw a lot of greed, and towards the end of that series, you see, I mean, the other dude, I forget his name, but he had a giant complex. He had like a cult.
Right.
He had like a almost a sex cult, and he was like accused of killing baby tigers, right? But it was greed, right? It's very greed oriented, and I think that goes across the world as well, but for maybe different end purposes. So, you know, maybe in Asia, in the Asian markets, it's less so about being able to take a quick photo with a baby tiger and more about using, you know, like ground up rhinoceros horn as an aphrodisiac, right? It's this pseudoscience based, what's called, you know, traditional Chinese medicine. And this is where it gets really tough, right? Because at one point, you know, part of my thinking as someone who's very interested in cultural anthropology, traditional medicine in various cultures is an important part of culture, an important part of sometimes people's mythologies, and it's deeply culturally rooted, right? But it's not always rooted in science. So you and I both watched like a little piece about this photographer who was going around documenting the Asia's illegal animal trade, and he was talking about how, you know, that whole thing about the rhino horns with the aphrodisiac. He said, well, what really happens is rhino horns are porous, right? Or they can allow for things to kind of be stored within the horn. And so they dip it in Viagra. And so when you're selling the horn, people think, oh, yeah, it works, man, it works. Like, no, it's actually a proven scientific medicine, you know, which is added on to the rhino horn, but then it's sold on the black market. And so, you know, there's a lot of dishonesty, and of course, you know, transporting rhino horns of an endangered animal. Like it gets really tough because on one end, it's hard for me to be this, like, you know, educated white man telling some other culture what medicines to use, right? That can be kind of really difficult in a gray area. But then on the other hand, you know, it's sometimes it's not really at all based in science, and it's endangering species.
Amen. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that take, because I think you're right. Kind of what we're seeing is this clash of forces between, you know, culture, tradition, conservation, modern science, and they're all kind of coming to head at this. And, you know, in a perfect world, I would 100% agree that it's not our job to tell other cultures that have a tradition of potentially using, for example, the rhino horns or tiger bones or whatever else it may be. And because I agree with you, I think that in a cultural anthropological standard, yes, allow that. But then, you know, the problem is that now we live in a global world, right? And unfortunately, things that can happen in northern China or in, for example, the Wuhan area can affect large portions of the population, you know.
Right.
And that's where I kind of take an issue with it, is because as a world, you know, humans are coming closer and closer into contact with animals, and that's not only in Asia. I mean, we saw that in Australia with the fires. You know, we had kangaroos showing up on people's doorsteps, and this closer proximity to animals in general, I think, is just both dangerous and not good for either party, because these are years, like billions of years of evolution that have put us on different biological and germ tracks, I guess you could say. And so, and yeah, that National Geographic article you shared that was quite interesting. I mean, it mentions what you said, is that, you know, pangolins, tigers, rhinos, they're all threatened species, and most health experts say that there are no health benefits, right? And so, and I think on a national scale in places like China, we have seen legislation that's slowly been passed from the 90s on. I think that's less the issue, because I think on a national scale, it's easy to pass laws. Like in '93, China removed tiger bones and rhino horns from their, like, Chinese medicine book. I forget what the name was, but then in 2010, the World Federation of Chinese Medical Societies urged people not to use tiger bones as well. And so I think on a PR standpoint, China's doing the right job. But then the problem is you have this large demand inside of a black market that has a demand in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, like you mentioned. And so it's one thing to just say you can't do it, but there's always going to be a market, and I think that's the harder part.
Yeah. I mean, even recently, right, China has adjusted some of its laws because of the reaction of the whole COVID-19, because again, we said, we've identified exotic animals traded in the Wuhan market as the most likely outcome or source of COVID-19. So, China temporarily banned wildlife trade in late January. They wanted to permanently ban some wildlife trade, but they've made an interesting distinction, which is, again, I think going to be a big problem, is that they've excluded traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, and they've distincted that that's not part of these bans. So you're banned from eating certain wildlife, but you're allowed to use that certain wildlife in the context of traditional Chinese medicine. And the problem with that is, in the context of traditional Chinese medicine, sometimes the wild animals are eaten for the medical benefits. So it's almost like they kind of allow this giant loophole. And then on top of that, like we said, laws, passing laws is good, but it only goes as far as to how much they are really enforced. And since 9/11, actually, we've discovered a massive black market for the exotic and just animal and wildlife trade. It was almost a byproduct, and that they mentioned, again, National Geographic had this little piece, and they talked about how after 9/11, major world powers were trying to really hone in on different smuggling routes. And of course, they were looking for terrorists, right? The United States, the UK, France, we were looking for terrorist routes and human trafficking related to terrorist organizations. But in that investigation and all this effort, we also discovered a super large black market for wildlife trade as kind of a byproduct of the new security measures. And so, it's actually, I think it's only shadowed by illegal drugs and illegal guns. And so it's up there with the big boys of black market trading. And it's definitely a concern. And again, this one photography piece, this photographer goes around and, they're pretty open. Like, you can walk into a market in Thailand and in China. There's people selling turtles. There's people selling, again, tiger teeth, all sorts of things that are illegal in some of these countries, right? Like you said, you're not supposed to be selling tiger bones, but people are. It only goes as far as it's enforced. And if it's not being enforced, then people are just going to still do it.
Yeah, completely. And the first thing is, yeah, like you said, there are so many freaking loopholes to get around this, right? And there's a Reuters article that talked about how street vendors can still harvest bat guano and sell it for their eye and spleen. And that one really kind of got me off a little bit, because bats are just such a disgusting, dirty, and reservoir-like animal that's been connected to every coronavirus that's been spread, and a numerous amount of other dangerous and fatal diseases. And so, yeah, like, all I have to do is tell you that I think they're going to help my sex life, or my stomach pain, or my vision, and you can take them. And that's, I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, it's an issue for public health, and
Absolutely.
and it's really interesting. Yeah, you talk about this investigation into foreign terrorism and trafficking, and they end up coming across a really vast animal black market. And I would imagine not much of that has really changed, because, like, the issue I have, and the sympathy I do have, is that a lot of these countries, I mean, China is a wealthy country, but it's a country of contradictions. It's a third world country and a first world country all put together.
Right.
And it's really tough to think that, there are people that probably just need this food. And that happens even more so in Africa, where, you hear about bushmeat, they're eating pangolin stew in Senegal and places like that. And it's really tough to try to squash a market when it is bringing people protein and nutrients as well, not just medicines, And so I don't know if it's something that could easily be squashed, because if you legalize it and control it, it's still going to be there. But then if you squash it, there's always going to be a black market. And so I don't really know where you go from here. What happens? Does the last tiger die before people realize there's a problem?
Yeah, and there was a powerful moment too in that documentary with the photographer, where he was he was at the White Tiger restaurant in China,
Hmm.
and in the middle of it was like this cage in the middle of like of the restaurant, so you could eat your lunch while looking at these white tigers. And he said that 50% of the world's white tigers are in that restaurant. And so, you have seriously endangered species, but greed is winning out, right? People want to, we'll put them in our restaurant so people can eat their food and we can have a popular restaurant. And again, it is hard, right? Because, poverty does play a big problem. 600 million Chinese people still make less than 100 US dollars a year. And so when you have that immense kind of poverty, and that's just China, not let alone Africa, like you said, Africa and
Yeah.
Southeast Asia, and then on top of that, you can net, you can find one fish from the Australian reefs. One fish can be worth up to $10,000. So if you're someone who's in extreme poverty, but you have the ability to maybe sell an endangered animal for the amount of money that would take you years to make, it is it's easier to understand why people do it. Now, again, I'm not justifying it, but it's part of the problem, right? It's we have to understand how poverty is also linked to this trade, and how people and poachers, right? Like, poachers in Africa are not wealthy. They're not running around in Mercedes G wagons and machine guns. They're impoverished people looking for a way out, and unfortunately, their way out is killing endangered rhinos and stealing rhino horns or ivory from elephants. And it's caused almost warlike stuff. Like, poachers have been killed, as well as the rangers that are protecting wildlife get into firefights. I mean, it's crazy. And I also think that another thing we have to look out for is the expansion of Chinese influence and what that means for this animal
Hmm.
trade, right? We've talked many times about the Belt and Road Initiative, and now National Geographic, just recently, as June 9th, is saying that Jaguar trafficking in South America is linked to increased Chinese investment, because as more and more, Chinese firms and Chinese workers are moving into South America to work on projects for this Belt and Road Initiative, they're also they also want to get, jaguar teeth and stuff for, again, traditional Chinese medicine or as little trinkets, and it's making it worse in places outside of Asia.
Yeah, that was something that I really had no idea about until you kind of mentioned it, I guess, last week. And I can't say I'm particularly surprised. South America, the Amazon region, there's a vast amount of endangered and just beautiful animals, and obviously there's a tradition in Chinese culture of looking for these for different medical uses. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, because the Journal of Conservation Biology found that from 2012 to 2018 in Central and South America, more than 800 jaguars were killed for their teeth, skins, and skulls, and then were smuggled to China.
Yeah.
And so for me, the irritating thing here is that that there's probably a bigger picture here with China. It's not just the low underbelly of Chinese society. Like, there has to be policy that's allowing this to take place, especially when China's so involved in the region, and they have working communities in there that want this. So there's a demand, and I think there's someone enabling it inside of the Chinese government. And I don't see there being a way to really stop that, because a lot of these Central and South American countries probably really need this foreign direct investment. They probably would really like to do work with China. And so how do you curb this without trying to dry up the tap between Chinese money and infrastructure? So to me, it's going to be very tough, and I know that article mentioned that jaguars could be replacing tigers, but there's a fear that that is not the case, because tiger bones are usually used for wine, and jaguar teeth are being seized for other ointments and other interesting things that I didn't even know they could use that for. And to me, it seems like if they don't do something soon, we could see a serious decline in the jaguar population. And I just think that would be something that's a shame. But obviously, I don't think Brazil is going to put down the foot about it. I don't think the United States is. And so you just wonder, like, how do you go about doing this? I mean, I know there's conservation movements in South and Central America, but when the Chinese are, fronting the bill on infrastructure, how do you stop it?
Yeah. It does really worry me that like the big players in the world are only going to start doing things once it's way too late. You know, what should happen is, I mean, like China with this trying to shut down wet markets in response to the COVID spread. they also need to start educating their people that, hey guys, actually rhinoceros horns don't do anything as an aphrodisiac. It's not gonna, it's not gonna do what you think it does, But unfortunately, I just don't think it's not a priority. And like you said, even things that are illegal, if they're not being enforced or someone could be behind it, I don't doubt that, if there's a major Chinese firm doing business in South America, I'm pretty sure some of those customs officers will be told, hey man, just like, you don't got to look through all these crates, right? Like, let this pass. This is too much money to cancel, right? You don't got to worry about the Jaguars. And, and another thing is, even in like developed nations, right? There's not always the infrastructure to track these things down. That photographer that we keep mentioning, who his life work is basically on the illegal animal trade, he said 2,500 tons of animals and animal products go through Heathrow in London every single day. Every single day. That's so much animal products and animals. And so he said he had this little like anecdote of like, if you're just a customs guy, and the guy comes in with what you think is legitimate papers and says, hey, I got 30 turtles, you count 30 turtles, you're just going to check it off. You have to. You don't have enough time, or there's way too much business to be going. So as long as you see some papers and the numbers match up, you check it off. But that guy doesn't know where those turtles came from. That guy doesn't know what those turtles are going to be used for. So even in like developed Western nations where we think we might have a better infrastructure to deal with something like this, in reality, we don't.
Right. And you have to think that there's a bit of just complacency. I mean, you have an underpaid customs worker, that's seeing thousands, probably, I don't know the numbers, but probably hundreds or thousands of people a day. And they're probably just going to say, what's the difference if there's one more container filled with bones, right? Like, right. There's no just top-down idea of, we just need to stop this, we need to curb this right now. And yeah, like you said, I mean, I could imagine it would almost be impossible to truly articulate how many go through there, and that's just another tough issue, and I don't think there's enough experts probably working at customs or different border locations to actually be able to like circulate and stop this. But I just see it continuing, and the problem is like, kind of going back to some of these wet markets that I've just seen photos of, like, they're just like, I guess for me, it's obviously, I think this is a moral issue, but for me, it's also just the public health fears for me that really just keep, and I just look at these wet markets, and you have like 10 to 15 different species of animals all together. Some are alive, some are dead. And it doesn't surprise me how the coronavirus went from a bat to potentially a pangolin or a civet cat, because, they're all in like a closed little space together. And then if you're the lady working at the booth, breathe in some bad air or get bit by one of these animals, and bam, and so like, I think actually the argument for doing something about this, unfortunately, wouldn't come from the moral side as much as the public health side, because we've already had like the European Union, the United States, Australia, all calling out China and the World Health Organization. And so I think China eventually, because I mean, let's be honest, China's done some bad things, and I would argue they're a bad actor, but they also do want to be a global leader. They want to be popular. Right. And so I don't think China is just going to blow this off. And as we're seeing, they are passing laws. Now, how far that goes is a whole other story. But I think it's going to take an international outcry. And we are seeing it, not as much with the animal trade, but just about the ramifications of COVID-19. Yeah. But China's also, already threatening to block trade from Australia. They're threatening the European Union. Obviously, the United States and China are in definitely a war of words. So I think it's going to need to be an international sanction effort or some form like that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly. And it does have to come down to educating the average person, right? Because as long as people still believe that they can cure diseases or medical problems through ways that are just scientifically proven not to, I mean, people have to be educated somehow. And unfortunately that, I don't really see how that's going to happen without the Chinese government kind of laying down, hey guys, just so you know, some of this traditional medicine is actually bogus. And it's hurting the environment. But I just don't see Xi Jinping or his government doing that, because again, like I do agree with you on the top side. It has to be We always talk about how we need coalitions of countries and to be on the same page and try and tackle these global problems as the globe. But on the ground, on the ground level, people just need to be educated that this stuff is kind of BS. Like, grinding up a rhino horn is not going to do anything for you. It's been scientifically proven not to.
Right.
I do worry that it's just going to be like, it's going to stop when the animals stop. I mean, rhino poaching activity between 2007 and 2014 grew by 9,000%, which is just amazing. I mean, in the wrong way. And at its peak, a rhino was getting killed every 15 hours. So,
Jeez.
yeah, I'm just so worried that like this will only end when the animals all die off. We're not even really talking about the other problems, right? Of like how global warming is impacting and how development is impacting animal numbers. This is really just the poaching and the animal trade, and it's just depressing. It's definitely not a fun topic to start looking into. But where we can kind of get some silver lining is, we have seen in the United States at least that conservation does work if you do enforce laws and you do have a infrastructure of like wildlife and game wardens and strong laws that people follow. The bald eagle, the American bald eagle, was almost extinct until now. It's come back into thousands of numbers and had a resurgence only because of conservation efforts. So the glimmer of hope for me is still there that if we can get people behind these things and we can get some real implementation of laws, there is the possibility that we can see a resurgence of things like the jaguar or the Bengal tiger or the white tiger.
Right, and I agree and disagree with that. I mean, I think on the positive side, yes, conservation definitely works. I think the problem is in Asia, especially Asia, you have just a different culture. Like they are willing to digest and ingest foods that most Americans and Westerners would find taboo, I think, and so it's very easy to tell Americans, okay,
Sure.
don't hunt a bald eagle, or don't you're not going to eat tiger bones or something, but it will be a change. But I do think that that's happening slowly in China. I think as education and wealth increases, I think the likelihood of people still eating these bush meats and exotic animals, I think, will decline.
Yeah.
And you've seen companies like Alibaba, team up with the Worldwide Fund for Nature and work on wildlife trafficking. And their goal is to reduce it by 80% by the end of 2020, which is a stretch, but there are companies, I think, that are aware of it, and I think more of the Chinese elite and the upper class in Chinese society understand it. But it's this education, like you said, but I think as the country develops, it will probably be seen. Now, I have to ask you, just kind of to be devil's advocate, do you think that because like they've mentioned, there's a lot of species that they're more abundant in Texas, for example, than in the natural world. Do you think with all this poaching and danger to the animals, in some ways they could be safer in a farm in Texas than in, I don't know, Kenya?
Well, certainly, and again, I think yes, but I think in a rehabilitation center, right? In a something that is designed and for the preservation of the species. Those that can't be reintroduced to the wild, give them the best life possible. Those that can be introduced to the wild, do so. But I definitely don't think the right way is to have it in private zoos like Joe Exotics. Now, I'm not saying every private zoo is like Joe Exotics, but the ones that are definitely on the gray area of legitimacy, where they're, you kind of get a photo of a baby tiger and then you don't realize like what happened to that baby tiger a year from now. You haven't seen him. I do think that rehabilitation centers are important, and legitimate zoos that do educate and are well funded and have good what's it called
intentions
and also good services for the animals. I'm blanking.
Okay,
Not cages, but habitats, right? Have good habitats. They serve a purpose. And definitely when you're talking about, species that are down to the last, like the red wolf is down to the last 100, maybe you make 50 red wolves away somewhere so that when things do calm down and maybe we have some more, legitimate conservation of land, then you can reintroduce them, right? So yeah, I do understand. There's a place for that, but my thing is the Bengal tigers in Texas are not in rehabilitation centers; they're in private zoos because Texas is so lax with exotic animal laws.
Right, right. And that was the takeaway I got even when I started watching Tiger King was you're going, everyone's coming here to take photos with the baby tiger, right? Everyone wants to take the photos with the cubs, but what happens to the cub in 2 years, you know?
Yeah.
And that was always the worry for me was it's when you only want profit and you want to incentivize, you know, the Instagram photo. You pay thousands of dollars and go take an Instagram photo. It's probably not for the animal's best interest. So I would agree with you. And so I also think just kind of my closing thought is that, for example, Dr. Bob shouldn't be allowed to go to Africa and shoot a tiger either, you know, and I think that's another thing that actually something the U.S. could easily do is, I don't know how you would go about it, but some form of legislation that does not allow Americans to go over and hunt, you know, exotic animals, endangered species, because that's something that's not about poverty. That's not about tradition. That's just about glory. And that's something I think that could easily be stopped if we tried.
Right. Have something like it's illegal to hunt any endangered species regardless of the local laws. Like, you know,
Yeah.
if you're a US citizen, you still abide by US laws even when you're around the world, in the sense that you can't go hunting endangered species for the photo op on your mantle. Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, definitely. I mean, you know, hunting and conservation have to go hand in hand, and oftentimes they do, right? You know, for a lot of hunters that I've talked to that hunt like white-tailed deer in the United States, they do care about conservation. You know, they're not just out there shooting like machine guns at deer. It's something that maybe I won't personally do, but I can understand how someone would do, and if they use the meat, and it's a tradition, and it's well regulated, right? That's the idea, is you can hunt white-tailed deer in the United States because we've regulated it so well that we understand the populations, we understand where they move, and we have limits. We have bag limits and licenses you have to get. That's all very important, and it has to go hand in hand with conservation. And so, yeah, I agree that around the world as well, they also have to go hand in hand.
Definitely no. And that's I've also got that out of, at least I listened to Steve Rinella. He's a hunter who has a show called Meat Eater on Netflix, and he's someone, you know, who just makes me feel better knowing that most hunters really do have a connection with not only the environment but the animals themselves, you know, and if it's done correctly, I think it's a healthier and more environmental way to actually eat meat. It's just unfortunately we get this image that the guy posted with a tiger or a lion in Africa, you know, and it does ruin it. So yeah, completely in agreement there. I don't know if you have any more thoughts, but I mean, we could definitely talk for hours on this one. There's a lot to cover.
It's a lot, and it can be kind of heartbreaking if if you're an animal lover. But you know, it's important to talk about, and especially like you said, you know, with COVID-19 within the wet markets, it's even more of a big question and a big concern. So to those listening, you know, what are your thoughts on the animal trade? You know, is enough being done? Are you worried about it? Do you think China has a major role to play in the future of the exotic animal trade? Have you seen Tiger King? Was it good? Any thoughts we want to hear? And as always, thank you for listening.